Welcome to Second Sunday Forum, uh, brought to you by Peace and Social Order Committee of the West Falmouth Quaker Meeting. Today is February 12th, 2023, and we're glad to present The Food Revolution, What Is It and Why Does It Matter? By Christine Smith from the Marion Institute Program Manager of the Southcoast Food Policy Council, formerly in the Catholic Relief Services and Catholic Charities in Baltimore and Idaho, among other places. The food supply chain, or the food system we all rely on, is a complex structure. And when we saw its fragility during COVID, together, we will delve into the following of what is a food system or supply chain? How did we move to industrialized food system? What do we need to do to change a revolt against this in the food system, and recover our health and food choices and many other things? Please, before we welcome Christine Smith, know that this is being recorded and that questions should be put in the chat, and that we acknowledge we are on Wampanoag land. Christine Smith, please take the lead. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me here, inviting the Marion Institute and the Southcoast Food Policy Council. So what I'd like to do is start off with our presentation, unless you have any questions about my background. You can always ask in the chat if you do. So with that, I'm going to screen share and get us started on what we're trying to do here today. So the Marion Institute is a nonprofit organization that was started about 30 years ago. And we have several programs you can read along the bottom: the biological medical program, the Grow Education program, which is basically the farm to school, and the greenhouse initiatives, which is basically nonprofits that are trying to start. We help them by doing fiscal sponsorship, meaning we do administrative work for them to help until they're up and running with their nonprofit status. And then we have the Southcoast Food Policy Council. They're all related in that we work on the integrative approach to whole body health with all the programming. And we focus on health equity, advocating for food justice, and building resilient communities. So that's the Marion Institute in a nutshell. So Erica and I spoke a little bit about what you were looking for. And I had suggested that we kind of term this the food revolution. I was doing this with UMass Dartmouth, some of the students there. And this was like one of the things they thought was really cool, is really looking at it as something we're changing or revolting against, so that it doesn't mean to be a violent situation. That's just something we're trying to change, really. But it's key to understand why this matters. And to start this off, we're going to look at what we're going to cover today. So we're going to do a land acknowledgement, which is something all food policy councils do. We're going to do a quick overview of the food system just to make sure we're all on the same page. We'll do a real quick history of how did we get here. We'll talk about food equity and what does that role play in what we're trying to change. I'll briefly talk about some of the key takeaways of the South Coast Food System Assessment. And then I'm going to talk about the Food Policy Council and what we've done so far, and then what you can do in the food revolution, or what you can do to make the changes that are needed. That said, I'm going to move forward. So I'm going to take my time and read this very slowly and intentionally. We acknowledge that this land is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts. Pre-English invasion, this place, its gifts of fertile soil, waters, wildlife, and beauty had already sustained indigenous tribes for 12,000 years. We honor and respect the precious food sources discovered, harvested, and cultivated by Native peoples, and remain grateful to them for their connectedness to this land and their food traditions. We make these acknowledgements with intention and accept the responsibility for all we continue to learn. We will honor the resources which sustain us today through their protection. May food be just one of the many connections we use in our work to repair relationships with Indigenous and the people of color in all nations living here today. So I'm gonna share something in the chat. So if you go to native-land.ca, and I'm gonna put that in the chat. I'm gonna stop sharing. If you can cut and paste that into your browser right now, it'll actually give you a picture of what the native tribes around the world look like. And I know everybody's in different places, so it'll ask you to put your address in there, and then you can see what the indigenous folks in your area of the world look like, who they're comprised of. And just take a few minutes and check out who is in your local neighborhood. See all the different groups. If you are in the United States and you're looking at this map, what you're only looking at are federally recognized indigenous people. The truth is there are more than that in our area, and there's more than that around the world. But what we're only seeing is what is recognized federally. So within Massachusetts itself, it's a huge group of different bunch of people. If you are in other places, it'd probably be very similar, and it's a massive group of other people, and they're all over the place, different folks. And what we just want to do is just acknowledge the fact that this land is very old. All the land we're on was there long before we came here, and everything that we might have taken is really something that we need to work towards. So we are currently in the Food Policy Council working toward building relationships with the different groups in our area, Pocasset. We are working also with the different Wampanoag tribes and the Mashpee and the Aquinnah. And we're working with them in different ways. So each group has a different way that we work on them with them, whether it's land trust or it's other issues. So I just wanted to recognize all that. All right, so we're going to talk about the food system. I know there was a question in the chat about food revolution, and I'll get to that, but we want to have some basic understanding of the food system. So does anybody know what the food system is in your own words? You can unmute yourself to answer that question, or you can answer that question with just by unmuting yourself or in the chat. What is the food system? What's your understanding of the food system? Anybody? Have you heard the food system before, the words food system? It may not, which is why I've been doing this education a little bit, and that's fine. All right, so I'm going to go back to screen share. The food system is actually a mix of different things. It is the production of food, the processing of food, the distribution of food, it's food access, it's consumption and recovery. And the issue with working on the food system and why it's called the system is like the Rubik's Cube. If you've ever played with the Rubik's Cube, you cannot solve the Rubik's Cube by solving one side of the equation. You actually have to work on it simultaneously. So because it's a system, it actually impacts each other like an ecosystem in the environment. So you work on one piece and it directly impacts another piece. So that's why we have to use systems thinking, understanding that whatever decisions are made, whatever programs we implement, whatever policy we implement, it is directly impacting something else. And so we need to understand what those impacts are before we actually take intentional decisions around that. So what does production look like? Production is everything around food. So whether you're raising pigs, cows, food, like produce and vegetables and fruit, or you're a fisherman or an aqua fisherman, this is what you do. This is part of everything that includes production. Processing is a little different. It would be everything around the slaughterhouses. It would be taking animals to slaughter, cutting them up, cleaning them, packaging them, labeling them. It would also taking all the vegetables and fruit, and it goes into a big facility that gets cleaned, packaged, and labeled. Processing also includes these back-end things like commercial kitchens. How do you take apples if you're a farmer and turn that into applesauce? So you need commercial kitchens as part of processing in this particular area of the food system. Another part of the food system that we saw a lot of this pandemic was the distribution. It was very much in the media. We saw it all over the TV and the radio. What happened to our food supply? Why did it break down? Why were the boats stuck in the harbor? And why weren't there any food on the shelves? These are all questions around distribution, but also around warehousing. Did we have people sick? Was there anybody working there? Was there issues around paying people wages, and people were taking a look around and saying, you're not paying me good wages, I don't want to work here. It's also a question of, did we have enough storage space for freezing and dry storage space? So those are questions around distribution. Access is, we need to ask ourselves questions of, do you shop at a place like this? Or do you shop in a place like this? Access is both physical, it's also economic. Is it affordable? And we'll get to that part of access. Is it affordable? Is it healthy? Those are the questions around access and consumption when we look into the food system. Those are pieces of that bigger puzzle. One of the things that we saw during the pandemic was an increased understanding of what it is to have a comorbidity. What is that in relation to COVID? And what does that look like in relation to food? So here's a great quote from our local doctor at Tufts University, Friedman School of Nutrition and Science. And this is the bigger quote that I'm going to read you, not necessarily strictly what's on the screen. Because the pandemic of diet-related disease has happened over 30 to 40 years, we've ignored that equivalent or even a larger pandemic, and now they're coming together. And we're seeing that we need to set up an environment of people with poor metabolic health who are predisposed to COVID. And we saw that in the media, our understanding about comorbidities. We have not invested in the science that should have invested up to in this point to have answers for these questions. People are talking about, at that time, stocking up on personal protective equipment and stocking ventilators and stocking vaccines. But what about stocking science on food, health, and nutrition? That would have been incredibly important. And what we're seeing in the allies, cross-sector, across whether you're working in transportation, you're working in healthcare, you're working in housing, you're working in the food system, is that we're seeing a clear link between food and all these other issues. Food impacts and intersects all these issues, including healthcare, which is what we're looking at here. The other side of that puzzle around the food system is food recovery. Do we throw out organic foods in containers that will go into the landfill to emit methane gas that is more deadly than carbon dioxide? Or do we glean our food, recover it, put it back into the food system in some way, or do we compost it at like a town compost? And here you see community gleaners that are actually gleaning from a field. And just know that in the United States, 30% of food is left on the field. That's for a variety of reasons. It's not perfect. When you go into a grocery store, you see everything, a shiny red apple, it's perfect. There's a lot of food that's not perfect that's left on the field, or farmers are asked to grow bumper crops where they grow more than they actually need in the local community. There's a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's storage. You harvest all the food, and when it's in storage, some of it goes bad. So there's a lot of ways that food is not recovered. So those are the pieces of the food system. I'm going to stop sharing. Are there any questions so far on the food system? I just briefly went over something very complicated. Al, if you have a question, you can just unmute yourself.
Yes, I wrote a few minutes ago to you what is meant by the food revolution.
And that's what I'll get into with the during the presentation. But the idea is the idea of revolution is that we need to change what we're doing because it's not sustainable. And that's what I'm going to go through and show you, that it's not sustainable. So we cannot, and it will take all of us together working on this. There's no just one food policy, no one policy, no one farmer. Nobody can do it alone. It has to be a group of people, community, to actually change that system. It includes from a personal level, all the way up to the federal level and the international level. And that's what I'm going to show you.
Yeah, if people keep clearing the forests, there'll be no more forest left, and a lot of animals and plants will disappear.
Exactly. And we'll talk about that. I have one of the slides that shows the environmental sustainability or lack of sustainability in the trajectory that we're heading in. It is not sustainable, and it shows clearly what that will look like in terms of the global diversity of plant life and animal life.
Right.
So I'll get into that. Good question. Thank you. I'm just going to quickly answer what is the Marion Institute doing with the Mashpee? So we're working with them just quickly. Sorry. The Mashpee Wampanoag, for those of you who aren't aware, they're on the Cape and the islands and in this area, part of the South Coast from New Bedford coming into Plymouth County into this area. So they're extensively in this area. And we are working with them on farm to school projects. We're also working with them on just general food recovery, and we're trying to engage them to be on our community advisory board. So we're working with them in multiple ways. We're also doing land recovery on the Cape, and that's a whole other thing that it's not my story to tell, but that's the kind of work we're doing with them. All right, I'm gonna go back to our screen share to the presentation. I just gave you a brief understanding of the food system. I'm going to encourage you to go to the foodsystemprimer.org. This is the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. This nonprofit from Johns Hopkins University in Maryland grew out of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I encourage you to check out this. All the food policy councils across the United States use this, the foodsystemprimer.org, as a baseline kind of library or understanding of the food system. So if you want to dive deeper, this is where I would suggest you go. And it has a ton of other resources listed on each page. And think of it more, the actual website set up like a book with chapters. So I would encourage you to look there. Is there another question? Yeah, thank you, Paula, for putting that in there. All right, I'm going to move forward. Okay, so I get this question is, well, how did we get to this point? And the interesting part is everything changed because of the Industrial Revolution. Once in the mid 1800s, when we had the technology to actually do a lot more different types of things, whether it's in the manufacturing industry, the agricultural industry, we saw this huge change where people left the agricultural land and moved into the cities to work in manufacturing areas. But what happened on the farms? So what happened is we had a huge shift in cultural values at that time. Farmers, what you see here, although is a modern picture of what more agroecology would look like in its smaller groups of plantings next to different things, so the pests can help each other manage, and then you're not depleting the soil, and there's crop rotation and so on, meaning you'll plant in different pieces. That's more like the farming of what would have been done back then. But back in the Industrial Revolution, the farmers, although they continued to grow small pieces of land, they started to take away the diversity. They were starting to feed more bigger areas, use more machinery, use things that really killed the biome in the ground, in the soil. So these were all pieces where it started in the Industrial Revolution, and then it took off during World War I and World War II, and I'll get to that. So that's just the beginning, was in the Industrial Revolution when we started changing and making it easier to actually farm with less people and more machinery. So farming was more like this. You would have the animals that are in the same grass that is where you're farming and producing something, where you're growing things. The manure from the animals would get into the ground. You would have this constant regeneration of the soil. And again, it was still hard work, but this is kind of what it looks like. This is more of a modern picture, again, of agroecology, where you're trying to work in farm in the old way of farming, which is the way we want to do moving forward. But what happened after the Industrial Revolution? So the culture and the values shifted, like I said, to the expansion of the understanding of less employees is better, more machinery is better, whether it's in the office, the idea of mechanization efficiency, less labor, more production. The cultural values shifted with all this machinery. And what you see there is monocropping and big machines putting all that grain into the trucks. But what you're not seeing is the direct inputs and outputs. We're using more fossil fuels. We're producing more carbon dioxide. We're using less people. We're monocropping, so we're happening soil depletion and so on. And that continues with this picture. Wendell Berry, who is an agriculturalist and also a food system geek, for the lack of a better word, said there's two great aims of industrialism, which was to replace movement of people by technology and the concentration of wealth into the hands of the small plutocracy. And it seems to be close to fulfillment. And that no truer words have been spoken. We know that there's 3 or 4 main companies in the United States that own all the pig farms, and same with cattle, and same with all the seeds. And what you see here is also big pharma with pesticides that are being put into the ground, which also goes into the groundwater, which gets into our bodies and causes cancer. And there's also horrible runoff that impacts a lot of other things as well. So these are some of the issues around the back end of the Industrial Revolution, and what we're seeing is industrialized agriculture and what that really means. Again, this is a picture of what the monocropping looks like. It's again, mechanization, efficiency, speed, uniformity, standardization. Those things have all depleted our soil, has caused us to be vulnerable to storms and climate change. And we're now eating produce that is actually less nutritious than when our grandparents were eating the same vegetables. So we have a huge problem, which is just part of what we need to tackle in the food system. Now we can see that this is kind of blurry, but you can kind of see that when you go to a big store like Costco or to a big box store. This is just rows and rows of food. And it's quite overwhelming, honestly, when you go into a big store and you see all these choices and you see what's happened to the industrialization of the food. So the Union of Concerned Scientists have defined industrial agriculture as viewing the farm as a factory with inputs such as pesticides, feed, fertilizer, fuel, and outputs such as corn, chicken, and so on. The goal is to increase the yield measured of bushels and to decrease the cost of production, usually meaning exploiting the economies of scale and externalizing costs to the environment. So we today do not pay for the true cost of food. We don't pay for the farmer's fertilizer. We don't pay for the impacts on the environment. We don't pay for the fuel that's been used on the farm. So all these are being actually taken and now externalized to our health. Because of the bad food, we have been eating bad food all these years, from processed food to just chemically depleted or enhanced food that are causing a bunch of different diseases. So Al's, your question to what does that mean in terms of the deforestation? What does that mean in terms of what if we don't do anything? So this is from, this particular picture is from the United Nations Environmental Program that shows the environmental consequence of the degradation of our water system, pollution by fertilizers, pesticides, soil loss due to industrialization of agriculture. And this specialized industrialization of the agriculture has come at a loss of biodiversity and increased the vulnerability we have to weather events. So look at this map. So right now you can see on the black on the top how much diversity there is there. And then you see about in the 1970s, you see there's a divergence that occurs. That's really when the industrial farming industry really took off, and I'll explain some of that. So if we keep going as is, you see that bottom gray line. If we don't change anything, we will hardly have any diversity left, both in animals and in plants and humans too. And if we just only do conservation efforts, you see that yellow orangey line. We'll lose a lot of still diversity, but it's not enough. So if you look at that green line going across the top, we need to both increase conservation efforts, make production more sustainable, and make sustainable consumption different. So what we actually consume needs to be different. I'm going to stop sharing there for a second. Do you have any questions? Okay, I see. You put in the chat that you're just going to wait to the end. That's cool. All right. So that said, I'm going to continue on with part of the history and where we got, how we got here to this point where we have to look at this map and see that. So what happened in World War II? Everybody, all the men went to war. What happened to the women? They were put into the machinery of making war machines. They were at home trying to grow their own food, canning and preserving food. So there were some immediate impacts where we lost this huge group of people that were once doing actual farming, and not all the women could continue farming. Some did, but they did it on a very small scale at home. So that was part of the impact. And then we saw the actual 1960s. We saw some really big companies, or actually pharma companies, come together and provide processed food and really quick food, because now we have both parents back at home, we have everybody working, and they're trying to eat food on the go. So again, we shifted our cultural value to efficiency, and here is a part of the result. And same with technology. Our technology and having refrigerators in every home, microwaves in every home. There was a rise of disposable income. So then you started seeing processed food. How can we make this simpler? How can we make this better? But we never thought forward into what does that mean then for our health? So technology played a piece in it, but it was also, we were all back to work, but we were also not looking ahead at the healthcare cost. As a result, for those of you who remember the 1980s, that's how I remember it, was suddenly there was this huge mass rush to, oh my gosh, I need to lose weight. I need to go to the gym, Jane Fonda. And suddenly we're all on diets. We're all on diets. 1980s, 1990s, everybody's on a diet. There are all these kinds of diets. And we were unhealthy. We were an unhealthy nation. We were trying to figure ourselves out and what we should be doing. So there is a difference between food insecurity and food that is not nutritious. So we were eating a lot of nutritious food, but maybe not in the best triangle. The USDA came out with a triangle that made sense during World War II because we were in a scarcity situation, but we didn't change that triangle until very recently, where we have changed now that triangle so it doesn't look the same anymore. So I understand. So I'm going to wait for questions till the end, but I want you to think about what was surprising or shocking so far, what interested you. Just put it in the chat and I'll get to you towards the end. We're going to jump into equity and equality. There is a difference between equity and equality when we talk about food. Take a look at this picture. So on the left side, you see if we give people the equal amounts of access to food. And on the right side, you see what equity looks like. Sometimes you just need to give different people a different amount of resources for them to be able to access what they need. So what we're trying to do is change the thinking from giving people equal amounts of something to giving people more than they necessarily the other person. And that's a point of equity. How I can better maybe explain that was we did some focus group work here in New Bedford with many different communities. One of the things that came out of this was the idea that transportation is an equity issue, and how it's explained in the focus group was that if we go into a community, we bring a mobile pantry into a senior housing facility or a mobile pantry into a mobile home park, that is equity. We are taking away the barrier of transportation, which a lot of people have because they can't get there. They have no car. They would have to take several buses and walk many, many blocks to get the food. And you can't even take everything with you because you need too much to just put in a backpack or bags you can carry. So if we bring the food in mobile markets to places, that's equity. We're doing more for certain communities by taking down a barrier to accessing food. So that's an example of what food equity would look like in low-income communities. So the World Food Summit in 1996 defined food security as existing when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient and nutritious food to meet dietary needs. So that's why we're working towards equity, is this understanding of all people at all times with physical access and cultural access to the appropriate food. So those are key pieces we're working on. I'm going to share a quick video with you all, and this really describes what is the intersection of health and hunger, and why is it important? So you got to see some of what we're dealing with. When we talk about food insecurity and equity, it's a direct impact in our health. And the food revolution is really about changing the outcomes of the health side. So again, these are things to think about. You can put in the chat. Is there anything in that section that struck you? You can ask away in the questions, or if there's anything you're taking away you want to share, please share in the chat. So I'm going to move on now to the key things that we're working on that'll go into some of the research now. So I described the food system already and the Food Policy Council's role, and we have about, anyway, let me go backwards a second. The Food Policy Council's role is to evaluate a local food system. They're generally a local thing. That's what a Food Policy Council is generally, very local. Local could be a town, it could be several counties, sometimes it's even a statewide system. So we evaluate the local system, we provide collaborative solutions, we break silos, we do cross-sector work because food impacts everything. And then we also advocate for the needed changes. What's important about this is that during the 1960s and 70s, how this came about was that the ecological and food movement came together. We started seeing authors like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and identifying issues that connect food to the environment. And that was what the spun of the beginning of food policy councils. Later in the 1990s, food policy councils emerged in a much more significant way, tackling more of the structural injustices by breaking those silos and advocating. Currently, there are about 100 food policy councils around the United States. In Massachusetts alone, there are about 13 of us that are in different various stages of maturation. Some of us are new. Some of us have been around for 20 years. So we are working together to try to figure this stuff out at a very local level. So again, what we're trying to do is make sure that the food system in that inside blue circle keeps going. We want to make sure it's healthy. So our job in the Food Policy Council is to look at the outside rings and the cultural values, the federal policy, state policy, and town policy, work on those issues. So if we're looking at this macro level, the food system can keep working and we will benefit, the public health will benefit, the environment will benefit, society will benefit, and the economy will benefit from the food system. So our job is at this super macro level. So that is some of the pieces we are looking at in the Food Policy Council. So I'm just going to share some of the key highlights of the research. I'm going to blow through some of this, but some of this, while the Food Policy Council research was based in Bristol County, Plymouth County, and Norfolk County, it is not dissimilar to what's happening in the Cape and Islands. So this might look very similar. Then there is a group that's doing a food system assessment on the Cape, and I'll share that towards the end. So right now in our region, in the South Coast, what we have seen is that there are 8.1% decrease in farms since 2017. That's a huge decrease. And the actual land on the farms has decreased by 8%. And farmers are struggling because they're making 96 cents on the dollar, again, because we are not paying the full cost of food with everything that goes into it, whether it's compost, it's employee time, it's the energy that a farmer uses. They're taking the expense and not passing it on to us. So part of that is part of the issue. Part of the research also shows that urban agriculture is very baby and very nascent in our area. True enough. There is a lot of urban ag going on, but it's very small and it needs to grow. That's some of the big pieces from the research. Oh, I'm going to go back here. Also, some of the bigger takeaways is the average age of farmers has significantly increased. The average age is 61 in our area. We're not getting a lot of new farmers, local farmers in our area. And that is a problem. So one of the things we're trying to do is how do we break the barriers to accessing farmland, to buy the farmland, and then encourage younger people to actually get into this field of work. That's no easy task. It's very hard work to do agricultural work or aquafishing or fishing. So we're trying to break some of those barriers and make it more accessible to get into this line of business to feed us all on a very local level. I was asked to say something about regenerative agriculture, I just want to say, give a qualifier. I'm not an expert. I suspect if we reach out to farmers in the community, they would have a lot to say. But in general, some of the really practical practices are about regenerating the soil and soil health. And I've been talking about that earlier in the food system. And also about water retention and making sure there's safe water runoff, increasing the biodiversity on a farm. So making sure you have pollinators, that you are growing an incredibly diverse group of vegetables and plants and trees that are actually helping each other with pest management and a whole host of other things. We want to do carbon sequestration, and again, no tilling. We've been doing that in our community garden for years. There's no tilling in our community garden. You just plant and use a lot of, you're trying to build the biomass on the soil to create healthy soil. And over time, that'll break down and help us out in addition to composting. So pest management is another big piece of regenerative agriculture, is understanding which vegetables you're growing has which kind of pests that will eat from it, and plant something next to it. That pest won't run over to the other side. So you're actually controlling the pests by actually what you're growing. So there's a lot of information on that. But I would just say, check out the documentary, kisstheground.com. It's all about regenerative agriculture, but I am not an expert on this. So I defer to my colleagues or people here on the call for those of you who have more information. I'm just giving a quick summary or a glance at what regenerative agriculture is. So some of the research, again, looking at the food processing, remember what I said about this is really about slaughterhouses. This is about aggregating the food, meaning bringing it together to clean it, to package it, to label it, and to bring it into the community. The good news in the research in our area is we do have, you see on the top right there, the meatworks. So why this is important, why is it important we have a slaughterhouse in our local area in Westport? Is because we had to ship out all the animals to other states to get actually slaughtered. And that means the farmer's paying for all that to get done. And it also means they have to get into a queue to get it done. A lot of the big industrial farms are the ones that get the first choice on when they can get something slaughtered. So the small farmers have to line up a year and a half advance to get into a time slot to get to slaughterhouse. So the fact that we have something local is significant, and it's encouraging. And we also want more of these medium-sized slaughterhouses to work with the farmers that are medium and small-sized farmers and cattle. And likewise with grain. So I don't know if you guys know, but commercial kitchens are actually hard to come by too. So there's something called Grange and Hope and Maine, and they're commercial kitchens out of Rhode Island area, and they're the closest thing. So if you're a farmer and you don't have the ability to take your apples on your farm and can them or make applesauce, you have to find a local commercial kitchen that's certified that you can actually do this on. Or if you are just a person who's in the food business, you're a baker, and you don't have a kitchen yet, you just have like a stall, like a front store with no kitchen, you need a place to actually make all your stuff. So you need a commercial kitchen to actually make your stuff. We don't have enough in our area. We just have the one in Rhode Island. We're currently building one for the New Bedford school system, just for the schools, to make scratch cooking for all of the New Bedford public schools. So we need more of these. That's what the research is showing. And then Coastal Food Shed is like a food hub where they're gathering all the food from our local farmers, and farmers don't have enough staff to go to all the farmers markets. So sometimes you go to a farmers market, you're like, where are all the farmers? Why is there just a volunteer here? That's because they don't have any capacity to actually be at the farmers market. So what they need is they need a medium broker. So Coastal Food Shed is like a broker who takes all that food from the local farms and then pushes it out into the community through their mobile farm stand, through an online market, and through farmers markets. So we need more of these types of food hubs who can take, like, hey, farmer, you don't need to worry about, or hey, aqua fisherman, you don't need to worry about that. I will take your food and I'll sell it out there. Don't worry about it. So we need more of these kind of food hubs that can take that food, process it, aggregate it, for the farmers and sell it out there. So that's one of the things the research showed in our area. And it's the same thing for the Cape. Although the Cape's doing a great job with farmers market and other areas, we do need to grow this out, and I'll explain why in a bit. Now, food access and consumption. Again, we did a survey during the COVID. During this research time, we surveyed 490 families, and we found out that it's no shock, 80% rely primarily on big box stores like Walmart and Stop and Shop and other places like that. And the problem was that if you were in a city or a town, you are often more than a mile away from the local grocer. And that doesn't mean, that could mean a gas station. So there's lots of what we call food apartheid spaces, where there was intentional systemic structural racism that part of it caused the ability for big like grocery stores not to come into an area, and instead you're stuck with a small grocer and that's the only thing they have is that type of food. We also found in the urban area, like for instance, in the Cape area, if you can think in terms of if you might be 20 miles or more from your nearest grocer. So part of the issue is physical access. And again, that point of equity, we should be going to people who don't have the ability to have transportation and bringing the food to that space. That's the issue of food equity. So some of the things we found in the study was that 39% of the people we surveyed found that they're often worried they will run out of money before they can buy more. And the thing that they can't find or they have the hardest time buying because it's so expensive is meat, seafood, fresh fruits, and vegetables. So again, getting the box things, no problem. Canned things, no problem. It's getting all the fresh things that's been a problem. Diving a little deeper, and I know, again, this is not your area, but I do have a slide for the Cape, but I just want to show you just a small snapshot because it's probably very true on the Cape as well, is that what we found in a survey is that 45% of the people who are eligible for SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Program, don't apply for it. No, that's a problem. So getting the word out about who's eligible for SNAP, how to apply, to break down all the barriers of application is one of the things we actually worked on in policy. And I'll share that a little bit later when we talk about some of the successes we've had. And of course, Black and Latino communities have been disproportionately impacted by food security during the pandemic and now. Now on the Cape, what I found is I went to DTA, Department of Transitional Assistance, which actually runs the program for SNAP. This is a snapshot of what Barnstable looks like relative to Bristol, Plymouth, and Norfolk counties. So currently the head of households, this is November 2022, who received SNAP is 15,950 people. And the people additionally who receive that is 24,000. So it is a significant number who require SNAP. And that is to say that there's a lot of hardship out there. And that's not even counting the people who are eligible and didn't apply. So there is a SNAP gap that we're all working towards, and I can talk more about that on the policy side when I get there. Food loss and reduction, if you look at the triangle on the right side, that's really what we want to do with food loss and recovery. So any additional organics, we want to, one, reduce any wasted food. So we don't want people buying more food than they actually need. So for instance, we work with the New Bedford school system, and they've actually they've figured out their procurement or their buying process, and they know exactly how much they need. So they have almost no organic waste now in the New Bedford school system because of that. And if you can't reduce the amount of consumption that you have, if you do have organics, the next level down is to feed people. You would recover that organic food, that edible food, and you'd either take it to the food pantry, or if it's non-edible, you can take it to the farms. Maybe pigs will eat that. Or you can also take it to composting, whether it's home composting or a town compost. So the issue within the state is that the state has passed several laws, and recently in November, if you have less than a half a pound of organic waste a week, you must compost it or find a food recovery. It's the law. The issue is there's only currently 12 organic compost sites in Massachusetts. And I know there's a facility in several facilities on the Cape. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. So that's an issue that we need to work on as well, as our research showed. The local food economy is just to say that in our area, and specifically on the Cape, think about all the aquafishery, all the oysters, think about all the fishing that's going on. We actually employ an enormous amount of people in cranberries and in the fishing industry in our region, both the Cape and the South Coast. The issue is also we talk about the food economy is on wages. And do we have the ability to actually, those people in the food system are usually the same people who are using SNAP, and they're usually the same people struggling with housing. So we have to look at this again from a systems point of view of how food intersects all these other areas. On the policy horizon, we need to tackle a bunch of different areas, from wages to soil health to right to farm, to actually preserving our land. You do a lot of good work on the Cape and Islands, actually doing land conservation. So it is not gobbled up by development. And that's bravo, because that's the number one problem we have in agriculture in New England, is that this is an area where it's being highly developed. It's a high concentration of people. There's a lot of land development going on, and we want to preserve the land. So that's part of the issue we work on with the food system when we look at that. So there's a lot of different other areas as well. So again, if you have questions about that research or that section, just put it into the chat and I'll get to it. How are we for time? Okay, we're good. All right. We're almost at time, right? I'm gonna stop sharing there. How long can I go on for? I'm sorry, I can't. Erica, you're muted. I'm sorry, can you say that again?
We can probably go over time, 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay, I'm gonna skip ahead to some
Okay.
stuff at the end that's more like, how can you get involved and why would you do this revolution? And okay. All right. So just know that the Food Policy Council is working on a bunch of different initiatives. You can go to our website and see all the different initiatives, from gleaning to an educational campaign to a building a food innovation district to the policy work, and how we're working with food equity advisors, some of our success stories with the Food Summit, our policy success stories, candidate forums that we're doing, and getting engaged with us. Just email sfpc@Marion Institute if you want to get involved in the policy work that we're doing. And for you guys in particular, if you're interested in food and joining the revolution, meaning changing, there's a lot of different places to jump into. So if you want to work with farmers and get involved in CSAs, you can go to your local buy local. It's called CMAP, the Southeast Agricultural Partnership Association. And they work with all the farmers in our area. Coastal Food Shed, which I already talked about, which is a food hub. Martha's Vineyard Island Grown Initiative for gleaning. You have the Cape Cod Hunger Network. You also have Mass 211 if you want to find more places to find food pantries. You also have about 10 composting sites across the Cape Cod, I think. And then you can then get involved in rescuing leftover cuisine. That's taking food that is prepared from hotels, schools, restaurants, and actually rescuing that food and bringing it to a food pantry. There's local, if you want to get involved, the nexus of climate change and the environment, capecodclimate.org, also savebuzzardsbay.org. And for legislative advocacy, you can join us again, sfpc@marioninstitute.org. We also work with probably 30 other coalitions. One of our biggest one is the MAFoodSystem.org. And we work with FRAC at the national level. FRAC is the Food Research and Action Center. That's particular to the Farm Bill that we're working on. And that'll be something we're going to take on this year because it's sunsetting in September. So you'll see advocacy at the national level on the Farm Bill from us. And last but not least, the important things, you have Farming Falmouth, which is actually doing a local food system assessment. I suggest you check in with them on where they're at with their research and their publication, but they are going to be doing one similar to ours, where they're just doing research on the whole system and what does it look like right now on the Cape and the islands. There's also sustainablecape.org if you want to find information more on farmers markets on the Cape, but more especially, they do a farm to school program in the Cape that's fantastic, and I would highly recommend checking them out if you're interested in the farm to school sort of work. Last, here's my email and my contact information. I will share these slides with Erica to share with you. And that's all I have. So I am going to go to the chat. Okay. Whoa. Let's see. Yeah, a lot. So there's been some comments on the forests. And yeah, we're trying to do a lot of work, again, cross-sectionally with different organizations that conserve land, that conserve forests. So our allies are land trusts. So the Food Policy Council and the food system allies goes beyond strictly food. It's the environment. So yes, we work with groups that work to protect the land and forests. So those things are all part of the food system. So again, it's helping people understand that the food system was more than food. It crosses all these different sectors, and we need to think in terms of that way. We need to think about bringing allies in that are not naturally who you think of. And that's piece of the work. Kim shared some information on farmers markets. Thank you very much. And yes, I see a question around why is 30% of the food left in field? I think I shared part of that answer. Some of that is, again, they're trying to harvest the best food, the most perfect food. Not all food, when you grow your own food in your home, if you've ever seen it, it's not always coming out the most beautiful and perfectly round or whatever shape it's supposed to be. So some of the food is left there. Some of it, when it's harvested, it is put into containers that are then put into a warehouse. Sometimes that food will go bad. So you have to go through that, like you saw a machine. People were going through the food to making sure it's perfect and putting aside the parts that are not. And again, that's part of that 30%, all those things collectively. And then you look at bumper crops as well. So there's sometimes farmers are paid for that as well. So there's some questions about that. So that's where that all that 30% come from. Lawrence asked, do you have any recommendations for how we can ask our government to take into account the impact of rising population on the demand for healthy food that produced on decreasing farming lands, land and water? Yeah, great question. So one of the things that we're looking at, so here in New England, we are part of New England Feeding New England, which is a coalition of all the New England states. And what we've done is we've done some research. They're in the process of doing the research, and what we're finding because of climate change, and related to your question, climate change has already impacted things so much that by 2030, we're anticipating an enormous amount of migration internal in the United States coming from the southeast, from all the fires and the droughts, southwest, from the fires and Intermountain West, to people are going to migrate to this part of the world in the United States. And from the southeast, because of all the storms and the rains and the flooding, we're actually not able to grow the crops we need to. We're going to see a mass migration. Notice this winter how temperate this is. This is going to be the new temperate zone. It'll stretch across the Great Lakes coming into New England. And that's where we're trying to actually find ways to produce more food in anticipation of not only feeding New England, but feeding the population we're expecting that will migrate up into our area. So that's part of the challenge that we're looking at. As far as telling our governments about that, they're aware of it. The good news from Massachusetts, for the first time, the food system is actually now part of the federal emergency management plan for Massachusetts. That was never done before. This past year with Governor Baker, they instituted it. Now the whole logistical food supply chain is part of the mass emergency food plan, or the emergency plan for Massachusetts during a crisis. So this is good news. As far as taking into account around the world, the idea is if you can increase local production and the understanding of buying local, then you will decrease the impacts on the environment. You will then increase the ability for people to buy local food. You'll be hiring local people. So it's like a circular economy. And that's the point of the local food system. And what we're trying to really push is the idea of a local food system, a circular economy. So we're feeding ourselves as much as we can. Right now, 50% of our food from Massachusetts is coming from California and Florida and other states like that. So we need to increase our production in our area. The rising population, again, speaks to that idea of, yes, certain foods are grown internationally, but also taking a look at how we can grow some of that locally and culturally. So we're speaking to the different Guatemalan communities here and saying, what are we not growing that we should be growing here? What kinds of seeds will work? We don't know yet. We have to work with the farmers to figure all this stuff out. So it's going to be one of those, I think farming is more like an art and a science combined. So I think it's something we have to work on together. Yeah, climate change has impacted what we grow, and what that means is biodiversity. So what we're seeing is, because we're so heavily reliant on cranberries, we actually have to remand the soil and figure out soil health. And that research is currently being done. And NOFA, N-O-F-A, that's Northeast Organic Farmers Association, is actually leading the charge on the soil health research with UMass Amherst. And they're doing this big thing right now, trying to figure out, how do we work with the soil along the coast, since it's super salty, it's super marshy? How do we figure out land that we can actually use? And that's, again, where I speak about land trust. There's like this understanding of how conservation, land trusts, and farming work together for the future. And how do we stop all this development of the land so we can actually use that land for farming? Likewise, with fishing and aquaculture, we have to look at all those particular pieces and how they fit into those puzzles. And there's no clean answer, and it's very complicated. I wish I could give you a simple answer to that, but it is not. Sylvia Manning, in Vermont, we have meal sites, all standard, all old American diet, scads and scads of plastic for sending meals home. There should be discussion of how they're counterproductive and improved sufficient. But there's hardly any effort to change or willingness in these recent public funded sites. Interesting. So we love, we're actually look at Vermont as one of those awesome places, farm to table. Vermont's got a really good system going, but there's a lot of work to be done for sure. The issue around recovery of food is one of the big key pieces that really goes down to getting restaurant owners involved, getting the institutions like prisons, hospitals, schools in these discussions around food recovery. So for instance, we got the New Bedford school system to stop using plastic in their food recovery and use recyclable materials for both packaging stuff for the kids to take home and also what is going to the compost site. So yeah, there's a lot of education to be done, but think of it in terms of institutions and systems and getting those people to start talking about that. A virtual market, Paula Bloomfield, the virtual market is, if you go onto coastalfoodshed.org, it's the local farm food. You can actually see pictures of all the produce, and you just click it like you would buy, like on Amazon, and you click what you want to buy. You can use your Snap and your Hip on the virtual market and have it delivered to you, or you can go to a site and pick it up. So the virtual market with food is going to be, might be something we think more about in the future, but it's also about, again, bringing food to people. For those of you who grew up in that city, do you guys remember where there was farmers on a horse and a cart, and they would bring their carts into the city and sell the fruits and vegetables in your town? I grew up in Baltimore. I remember seeing that. And that was something, that kind of idea, but think of it in terms of a mobile market where it's like a refrigerated truck that has all this produce, and that they're bringing it around. So that's more what we want to see, both the mobile markets and virtual markets. So local farmers can sell their food locally. That's a virtual market. Kim Alsup, regarding agriculture, regenerative agriculture. Yeah, I didn't spend a lot of time talking about animals, you're right. While animals in the industrial ag are kept in confined animals and regenerative farming on the glass in the fields. Yeah, that picture I showed. Yeah, precisely. So that's a really good comment, Kim, all those pieces. Lawrence Jordan, how can regenerative and urban farming and innovation in the components of the food system contribute to expanding the total food supply capacity? So yeah, what we're trying to do is expand the urban farming. If you've ever heard of Groundworks, check out Groundworks South Coast. They're actually in the South Coast area here, and they're trying to help communities to organize and to look at abandoned sites in the towns, but they're also looking at public parks. We've passed a law recently at the Massachusetts level where state parks are now the places where you can farm, and they have already allotted spaces in different state parks where you can actually, as a community, come together and farm. So we're just trying to clear out space, make space in urban settings more accessible. The problems with urban settings is brown zones, where it's already been polluted such an incredible depth. It'll take a lot of money to remand that space. So we're looking at all these different issues, and different towns are tackling it differently. So you can check out if there is an agricultural commission in your town. Awesome, go to those meetings. If there's none, you can actually get one started. Kim also shared something for Larry. That's great. And yeah, we need to farm without destroying forests. We can actually add forests into the farms to help create that biodiversity with the pests, the different things that need to be there to help the soil. Regarding getting involved, Pariah Dog Farm run by young farmers seeks volunteers. Great, good. Another resource, Flax Food Co-op, my shopify.com. Excellent. Why are only 49% of those eligible actually getting SNAP? What policy measures are being used to get others on SNAP? Great. Okay, so that brings me back to that policy success. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, so what we found out that when you're on SNAP, you usually need other benefits. You need WIC benefits, you might need veteran benefits, you might need utility benefits. And what we're finding is people who want to apply for SNAP, they're finding it burdensome. The application process for each of these are individual, and they're very complex, and you have to have a lot of paperwork. You have to bring in your paperwork, you have to have proof of all this paperwork, and if you're not literate with technology, if you try to take a snapshot of your paperwork and send it in, often people find that very confusing. You might have language barriers, it might be complex. So what we've done in a policy level is we put together one application for all these different benefits, including SNAP. So when you go on to Mass Health, if you're low income and you want to get health care, once you're on Mass Health, you just click a box and all your information will go to the different government departments that take care of SNAP, that take care of WIC, that take care of utility benefits, and so on. So we took down a barrier, which is again an equity issue. We took down a barrier to SNAP. Now, the other side of that is cultural as well. What we're finding when we talk to people is that there's shame issues and there's cultural issues. So it's not in their cultural understanding that we should be using a federal program. It could be shame issues like somebody else needs it more than I do. This is for somebody else. And we see this a lot with college students. We have a lot of college students on SNAP who don't think they should be on, like they don't feel like they're eligible for SNAP. So getting over some of these cultural understandings and having a better education, making it more accessible, that will help us reach all those people who are eligible, they're not using it. And it often needs that direct contact with people to get people onto SNAP. So great question. So Erica, what are college growing issues regarding climate change? Well, I think you guys might be the best to know that. So you've seen the FEMA flood maps, and most towns have some sort of FEMA plan put into place. You can see where the flood zones are going. So the idea is really about how do you mitigate some of these issues? And then where's the land that's not developed that you can conserve for perpetuity, and you can conserve it for both just the general public to have, or you can also conserve it in partnership with the town, and it can be used for agricultural purposes. Depends how it's going to be zoned out. There's a lot of regulations wrapped around this. I'm making it simple. I'm simplifying it. It's much more complicated than that. But some of those issues are wrapped around that. They're wrapped around that we're going to see more storms, greater intensity. So you need to have more biodiversity on the land to actually keep those trees down. You need to keep all those plants rooted. So you need to have really good soil, and that needs to, there's a lot of work revolved in all that regarding climate change. All right, great question. Link to virtual market. So if you, I'll do that in a second. Kim said, I think Bootstrap Farm Club is what is meant by virtual market. Okay, great. Thank you for that. All right. I know I ran over a lot. Are there any questions? Any other things? Did I miss something? Okay. I know I spoke a lot. So if you have any questions, if I didn't get to something, if there's any follow-up information you'd like, I can, if I don't have the information, I can find people that might. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you guys being here and listening, and your good questions, and also your good resources that you put into the chat. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Christine Smith, for coming to Second Sunday Forum, and I hope you come again. There'll be future presentations, and I won't mention those, but thank you for coming, everybody, today. Stay well and stay connected.